Alright, today we are in study 18 of our study in the letter to the Philippians. Today we're in chapter 4, verse 15 to 18. Before we do that, we'll look at the answers to the questions for verse 10 to 14. Now remember, we're in the same theme, this issue of the cares of the world that we've been looking at from verse 5 or verse 6 onwards. And the first question was about how Paul felt when he received their financial gift. And it says that he had joy, he rejoiced. So this gift gave Paul joy. Now, it's not so much the gift itself that gave him joy, as we'll see later on, but it's the fact that they loved him and they wanted to send it to him. I love that in chapter 1, verse 25, Paul wants to remain so that he can give the believers more joy. And here in chapter 4, verse 10, they are giving him joy. And as you see also chapter 1, verse 4 and chapter 4, verse 1, they are his joy, as well as him wanting to give them joy. And this is the beautiful potential of Christian relationships. If each person in the relationship is living out the realities of chapter 2, verse 1 to 4, if each person is seeking the welfare of the others and no longer focused on self-interest, but on helping the other brother or sister, then the conclusion of that is that each person will have great joy. So it's such a beautiful picture of this relationship, seeing Paul rejoicing over them and also them rejoicing over him. The second question was, what secret did Paul learn? And Paul has learned to be content in whatever situation he is in. It's quite interesting, but when he was in Philippi, he and the team stayed in a woman's home called Lydia. You'll see that in Acts 16, verse 15. Now, Lydia was a wealthy businesswoman, and so he would have been well looked after with his friends while he was staying there. But not long after that, he was beaten and thrown into prison. And you can see that just a few verses later in Acts 16, verse 22 to 24. And yet in the prison, he is praying and praising God. Hold on, praying and praising God? That's exactly what he told us to do in Philippians 4, verse 6 to 7, that we praise, we're full of thanksgiving as we make our requests to God. So whether in a palace or a prison, Paul was content. He lived a life free of grumbling and complaining, the life he tells us to live in chapter 2, verse 14. Remember, Paul has been saying, what you've seen in me, live that out. And they had seen a life without murmuring and complaining. They'd seen a life of peace and contentment. And that's what he wants for them as well. The third question was, how did he learn this secret? Or how was he able to be content in these situations? Well, this peace and contentment doesn't come from ourselves or from anything around us, which is why chapter 4, verse 7 and verse 9 tells us that it's the peace that comes from God. Paul says in 4, verse 13, that it's the strength of Christ that enables him to be content in whatever scenario. That verse is often used for lots of different things, but in the context it means that he has learned how to be content. He can do all things through Christ who strengthens him, is that he can be content whether he is doing well or he's living in poverty or he's in prison like right now. Now, this idea of being content and at peace is a fruit of the gospel work that God is doing in us. Chapter 1, verse 6, chapter 1, verse 9 to 11, and chapter 2, verse 12 to 13. Paul was working out his salvation, and one of the fruits of that was that he was at peace and content. It was God who was working in him mightily, remember, in chapter 2, verse 13, and what part of the work then was to work in him, it's Christ that strengthens him, was to be content. Now we're going on to verse 15 to 18, and we're still in the same theme here, this idea of the cares of this world. So the first question for chapter 4, verse 15 to 18 is, how long and how often have the Philippians supported Paul for? You'll see that in verse 15 to 16. I'd also encourage you to go and read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8 to verse 9. The second question, why does Paul want them to give? And that you'll find that in chapter 4, verse 17. And then the third question, how does Paul describe their financial gift? And you'll find that in chapter 4, verse 18. God bless.